I would also like to start by acknowledging the sovereign custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. Now, what I'll be focusing on today are the stories of encounters between Italian migrants and Indigenous Australians. And as Joseph was mentioning, my main area of research is film studies. And it's interesting to note how these stories have very rarely been portrayed in film and documentary form by either Italian or Australian filmmakers, reflecting a lack of interest that is not incidental, but as I've argued elsewhere, is almost constitutive of how the migrant's sense of belonging is created and negotiated in contemporary Australia. Now, while these stories rarely appear on screen, if we look instead at what goes on off screen, that is to say behind the camera, we can understand how important these encounters were and how much they shaped the history of Indigenous and cross-cultural filmmaking and activism in Australia. What I'm referring to here is, of course, the work of the Italian director Alessandro Cavadini, who between 1972 and 1982 co-directed, together with Australian filmmaker Caroline Strahan, his brother Fabio, and a number of Indigenous communities across Australia, documentaries that portrayed the struggle for land rights of Indigenous activists and communities in the 70s and 80s. And most importantly, he set out to do documentaries that disrupt the existing models of collaborative filmmaking and set up instead what I identify as a participatory framework that exposes the enduring nature of settler colonialism in Australia. Now, the objective of this presentation is of course part of a much larger project on the cinema of Alessandro Cavadini, in which I'm interested in exploring and understanding more in detail how he set out to challenge these established approaches to documentary and ethnographic filmmaking. I'm also interested in his working relationship both with urban and remote Indigenous communities and activists, and in the transnational circulation of his works, the way they were used also by Indigenous activists as tools of resistance in Australia and abroad. What I'll be focusing on today is Two Laws, the film that the Burla people of the Gulf region of the Northern Territory co-directed with Cavadini and Strahan in 1981. And this is a 2 hours, really, it's a groundbreaking documentary that was produced by the Mara, Yanla, Garwa and Gurdanji people of the Burlula community to support their land claim, what was in Australian history the first land claim, 1977, and keep their histories and laws alive for the next generations. Refusing to replicate the colonial gaze of previous non-Indigenous ethnographic productions, Cavadini and Strahan decided to, as Davies and Plates have argued, surrender control of the camera and of the production to the community itself. So this is why we speak about a film that is made by the Burla people in collaboration with Cavadini and Strahan rather than the other way around. As we will see, the result is a collectively authored reflexive documentary that mixes oral testimony and dramatic reenactment from within Burla law, perspectives and aesthetics. A film that is indeed unique and foregrounds what is really interesting to explore today, that is the creative and decolonizing power of encounters between Indigenous and Italian activists and artists, and prompt us to reflect on our own experience and research practices as migrants living on Indigenous country. Now, Alessandro Cavadini was born in Italy. He was educated at the Accademia di Belle Arti in Milan, where he worked in design, theater and film. He then moved to Paris to document the students' protest of 1968 before moving to Australia with his brother and director of photography Fabio, who is still working and producing films in Australia to this day. They moved to Sydney in the early 1970s. And here Alessandro first worked for the Nuovo Paese, which was an Italian newspaper in Sydney, before becoming a member of the board of the Sydney Filmmakers Co-op and of the film journal Film News. Now, in 1972, Alessandro and Fabio got in touch with the indigenous community of Redfern and established a relationship with some of the most important activists of the time, including Paul Coe, Gary Foley, Mam Sher, Isabel Coe, Chica Dixon, and Bob Mazza. The result of these relations was Ninglana, which is the documentary that first brought the story of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy and of the 1972 Indigenous Land Rights Movement to the attention of the world, and what Indigenous academic and activist Professor Gary Foley has called, indeed, the single most important film on the Aboriginal struggle in the last 50 years, a film that was brought also to China by a group of Indigenous activists a few years after. Now, it was during the post-production of this documentary that Alessandro met with Caroline Strahan, with whom he then wrote and directed his later films, Protected, We Stop Here, and Toulouse. And Protected is a really interesting documentary from 1975 in which we get, going back to what Francesco was saying, a completely different perspective on what was going on Palm Island, because it's a documentary about the 1957 Indigenous strike on Palm Island, which takes us from... There's a quite different story, and it's incredibly interesting for that. Now, Toulouse, as I was mentioning, was commissioned. It's a commissioned film. It's a film that is commissioned by the Burulula community to Alessandro Cavadini and Caroline Strahan after being contacted by the activist and member of the Northern Territory Land Council, Leo Finlay. Now, Cavadini and Strahan accepted the invitation into the community. They went to Burulula and they spent more than 2 months traveling across different settlements in the Gulf area of the Northern Territory, learning their kinship relation within the Mara, Yanula, Garoa, and Gurdanji people, and discussing with them how they wanted to approach the film and the filmmaking process itself. As I said, the community was at the time involved in the proceedings before the Aboriginal Land Commissioner concerning the legal rights over their land and wanted the film to provide the validity of their historical claims, of their sovereignty and of their systems of law. In other words, the film was meant to be used as a proof in a court. And as McBean notes, these first pre-production months were crucial for both Cavadini and Strahan to understand just how Burulula decision-making processes worked, how different stories belong to their respective keepers within the community, and to start the process of widespread consultation and participation that resulted after 2 years of work in the documentary. Now, still, this complex and groundbreaking work is not simply preoccupied with presenting us the difference between the Australian settled colonial legal system and what I'm referring to as Burulula law, but in completely overturning the power dynamics of representation by showing history and culture from within a Burulula perspective and using Burulula aesthetics. Now, the film is structured in 4 separate acts, which are arranged roughly chronologically into sections which are called Police Times, Welfare Times, Struggle for Land, and Living Within Toulouse. I would like to show you a scene from the film where we can really see how this process of preparation for the reenactment of the stories worked. We truly see how collaboration went on between Cavadini, Strahan, and the people of Burulula. And you will be hearing from Tommy Dodd and Old Dolly, who in Police Times retell their stories. You can see how they act as the directors of the scene, giving out parts and arranging things.
There are many stories of that time, but we chose it to tell you one which happened in 1933.
From there, now you better believe that book.
This is a meeting for part 1 of the films. Tommy Dodd was grabbed and taken on patrol by policemen in 1933. He is telling his story to the meeting.
Poor fella, did you hear that bullock? Boots? Now? Hey. Tell me true. Before killing me. Or you pick him up another? Go on, tell me so. You put in the jet first, no bag. Which way? Oh, you making us. Oh! Well, you tell me so. Before hearing me. Yes. Đừng hoang phạm. Đừng hoang cà phê.
I'm crossing now, cross him over. I wouldn't be there, see?
Nah, somebody, I can walk, them not talk.
You can tell him. You know what? You can tell the policeman what to do. Like, you tell him.
Somebody can hack for you.
Come on, Michael. Baba, you're sad.
From Freddy's sister.
Freddy's sister. Yeah.
And Freddy's sister.
Still play her sister.
And your mommy, your mommy like you. Body. Flora. Another one, auntie.
That same policeman took old Dolly in 1933. She choosing parts for the woman to act in the film.
All right. And if you watch the documentary, you realize that just how much old Dolly is the true director of the first section, because she reappears throughout this whole first part. Now, what is interesting here is how throughout the whole documentary, the Burula community combines forms of dramatic reenactment, oral testimony, and these really wonderful self-reflexive moments where we truly see how decision-making processes work within the community to reframe their history and culture through a Burula perspective, as Alessandro and Caroline instead surrender control of the camera and of the narrative. Another interesting aspect is that the whole film is shot with a wide-angle lens. You will have noticed the almost the fisheye effect. Now, this is a precise narrative choice and an aesthetic choice because it allows men and women from the community, keepers of each story, and those who enact instead the story for the camera, as well as Alessandro and Caroline, to be represented in the frame at all times and according to the socially logic position that they occupy within Burula kinship systems and Burula law. So by opening up the frame, creating this fisheye effect, Two Laws also invites us as viewers to position ourselves within the audience who is listening to the stories presented and to establish an active relation with the keepers of each story. The film is thus best understood as an active and legitimate enactment and record of Burula law and aesthetics, and it was of pivotal importance for the final 2006 and 2015 deliberation that saw some of the land that was originally requested in 1977 returned to the community. So this is why, again, this film was crucial in the process of land rights for the Burula community. Now, to close, as Anne Courfoys has noted, building on the work of Eileen Morton Robinson, the debates on national identity and belonging in Australia are often structured along two separate lines of research. On one end, there is a focus on the relationships between indigenous and non-indigenous people and on the history of dispossession and persisting colonialism. And on the other end, almost separate from this, there is instead the focus on the migrants' sense of identity, multiculturalism, and ultimately on the position of the non-Anglo migrants within Anglo-Australian society and on their sense of belonging. Now, Two Laws and the other films that Cavadini made between 1972 and 1982 show us instead the decolonizing potential of breaking away from these paradigms. And we see this in particular in a scene which unfortunately we don't have the time to show today, but it's a scene where we see a migrant from Yugoslavia in the film discussing the legal concept of land tenure with a local junkai, the security custodian of the land that this migrant was desecrating by raising the trees. Now, if we contrast this scene instead with the filmmaking process, the protocols that Cavadini and Strahan developed with the community, we can understand what Joseph was mentioning before, this idea of our obligations as migrants to acknowledge and embrace indigenous histories and cultures as a contemporary, and I want to stress contemporary, and sovereign systems of knowledge that can contribute to the struggle for land rights and decolonization in an active and creative way. So this is an example of what these sort of encounters can generate. And they do bring about changes in the material conditions as well, because as I mentioned, the documentary was used as a proof within a court of law. Now, to end, the film provides us with an account that complicates our understanding of our position of migrants and the position that we occupy within contemporary Australia. And it also points to how these alternative and decolonizing methodologies of belonging can challenge dominant models of representations and identity, and I think we will hear more about this from Maria. Thank you.